This is season 4 of Southpaw Deep Space Nine. Season 5 will be released on the Southpaw Pod Patreon. This episode was recorded on July 2nd, 2024. We are back with Southpaw Deep Space Nine Season 4. If you don't know what SDS9 is, it's Southpaw's completest DS9 watch-along show where we watch every episode, recap it, and analyze it. We are your hosts, Scott and Sam. But Scott, before we get into today's episode, I need to ask you something about a sci-fi show I've actually watched the entirety of, which is Battlestar Galactica, the remake. I know one of the DS9 writers became the showrunner of that show.
Yes.
I think I only found that out recently. But since I'm watching it in reverse order, Battlestar, then DS9, so not the way it chronologically happened. So much of what I thought was cool about Battlestar, DS9 did first. In fact, now I'm like, wait a minute. Battlestar seems like it just took DS9 scripts and wrote over it, including the chubby, goofy engineer dude with the Asian love interest. And then shoehorning spiritual stuff at the end of the series. It feels like you could only be amazed by Battlestar if you have never seen DS9 first, which is kind of like where I was coming from, where I had only watched random episodes, but I didn't really understand the entire story. And then I watched Battlestar and I thought the ending was kind of weak, but overall, it blew me away with like, who's the, shape-shifting, Cylons, and what's the spiritual aspect and all this other stuff. So Scott, what do DS9 fans think of Battlestar?
So I can only speak for a few people because while I know a lot of people that much love Ronald D. Moore's take on Battlestar Galactica, the Venn diagram, which is probably a circle in most communities of people that like Deep Space Nine and Battlestar Galactica, I don't know that many people that liked both properties. And I liked Battlestar Galactica. I think it's good, but I haven't watched every single episode. But when I found out that the guy that really loved Klingons wrote Battlestar Galactica, it made a lot of sense. Because Ronald D. Moore is pretty much you're going to see in this season. I've talked about it before, or I've hinted at it before, that with Ronald D. Moore starting to show up, you're getting a lot of Klingon world building. He loves Klingons. But for me, Battlestar Galactica is a good show. For many people, it's a great show. It didn't latch on to me the way other shows did.
So it latched on to me, but now if I think about if I had watched DS9 first, I don't think I would have finished Battlestar Galactica because it would have felt like a retreading. And also, the reason why I asked you about DS9 fans and how they feel about the show is because whenever I've talked to DS9 fans, they'll mention other Star Trek properties to watch. They'll definitely mention Babylon 5.
Mm-hmm.
They never, ever, ever, ever bring up Battlestar Galactica. And I thought that was interesting once I found out Ronald D. Moore went on to make Battlestar Galactica. So I was like, well, if they're not mentioning it and one of the writers was the showrunner for that, must be that a lot of them didn't like it that much.
I I didn't dislike it. I just wasn't it just didn't connect to me the way that it connected to my roommates at the time. This came out I was like 23, 24. So my roommates watched every single week. And this was pretty much pre streaming. So they would come home to watch it. I'm not saying it's a bad show. I think it's very good and there's some great acting and I've watched episodes, but it just takes a lot for me to be drawn in by sci-fi. While Deep Space Nine is my favorite TV show, I tend to drift towards fantasy more than I do than sci-fi.
Now I'm curious if at the end of this I'll like DS9 more, and maybe I'll like Battlestar less. I already like Battlestar a little bit less now, knowing that a lot of these ideas existed prior.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's all about taste. But where I'm at right now, if I'm excited to talk about TV shows, it's Deep Space Nine, um, Babylon 5, and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. And that's just where I'm at. And that's okay.
All right. So now let's get to today's episode. We are discussing Sons of Mogh. Scott, can you recap this episode?
Um, Worf and Jadzia are doing some LARPing with Klingon swords in the Hollow Suite. And I don't know about you, but I'm sensing maybe even a little bit of flirting. And then Worf is called by Odo to talk to a drunken Klingon. And guess who the drunk Klingon on Deep Space Nine is? Kurn, Worf's estranged brother. Worf scolds him for ignoring his messages. Kurn asks Worf to restore his honor by killing him in the Mach Tovor ritual. At Worf's quarters, we see Kurn. He's grumbling. He's not very comfortable. He's mocking Worf for siding with the Federation, and he's like, "Look, I'm trying to salvage our disgraced family house." Because as we know, Worf was ejected from the High Council, and this has created a lot of tension in the Klingon world. And Worf certainly regrets dissing their fam house by opposing Gowron, who's basically leading the Klingons. And Kurn dismisses this apology as another one of his human weaknesses. And Kurn is like, Gowron stripped the House of Mogh of its seat and property, and I have nothing. So he asks Worf that the only way to restore his honor is through the Mach Tovor ritual. Miles and Kira are returning from a border inspection. They're investigating some energy science thing, and they peep a Klingon bird of prey conducting some sort of military exercises. They retreat, but they are suspicious, dubious, if you will. Back on Deep Space Nine, Jadzia tries to find Worf because he missed their holosuite LARPing sesh and learns that he's going to angrily and seek this rare Adanji incense from Quark. And because as we know, Jadzia has a lot of connection through the Klingon people through Curzon, one of her previous entities. She knows what's going on. In Worf's room, Worf and Kurn are prepared for the Mach Tovar. It's a ritual where it's a Klingon ritual where a dishonored individual can regain honor through a ceremonial death at the hands of a close family member or trusted ally. Like some samurai sort of thing, but Klingon. Jadzia, who realizes Worf's plan, rushes to stop him, and Jadzia and Odo are able to arrive as Worf stabs Kurn, and they beam him to the infirmary, and he doesn't die. In Ben's office, he's like, Worf, what is going on? And Worf admits that, what he did was definitely against Starfleet regulations, could be considered premeditated murder under Federation guidelines. Jadzia tries to explain cultural competency, and Ben emphasizes that this ritual crosses Federation line. And Jadzia assures Ben that they will find other ways to resolve the issues within the House of Mogh.
A note to our listeners. If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, like early releases of Southpaw Deep Space Nine, our fictional narrative podcast, Fighters Brew, break-free versions of our shows without interruptions like you're hearing now, bonus articles, Fighters Brew transcripts with extra content, Liberation Martial Arts Online, as well as our private chat group on Discord. You can also make one-time donations at Ko-Fi or show your solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com.
Later, Kira and Miles, they brief Sisko, Ben, on their suspicious encounter with Klingons near Bajoran space. And Ben's like, they should take the Defiant to investigate, and orders them to keep Worf informed, but Worf is not allowed to join the mission. Miles tries to defend Worf, but Ben is not having it. In the infirmary, Bashir informs Worf that Kurn is stable. Kurn is frustrated, dismayed to be alive, and says Worf was almost a Klingon for a moment. But Kurn regrets not being in Sto-vo-kor, which is like the Valhalla for Klingon folks. But Worf assures him it's just not yet the time. And Kurn is like, you could have tried harder, bro. Jadzia visits Worf to apologize for stopping the ritual, for getting involved. Worf accepts her reasoning, but also notes that it is not honorable from a Klingon perspective. And Jadzia suggests that Kurn could stay on Deep Space Nine, join security, just chill here. And Worf is not sure that this is going to happen. He doubts that Kurn would necessarily join Starfleet, but Jadzia proposes that maybe he could be part of Odo's Bajoran security detail. And as Odo looks at Kurn's CV, and although concerned, he's like, fine, as a favor to you, Worf, I will make Kurn a deputy. And Worf's like, I owe you. And Odo's like, look, when you owe me something, I expect you to pay me back. And then Odo watches Kurn inspecting some freighters in the cargo bay, and Worf tries to pretend he has a reason to be there and just wants to check on Kurn's job. And Kurn admits that he's adjusting, he's ready to work, he wants meeting, but he hates the uniform. On the Defiant, Kira and O'Brien, they start to detect cloaked ships and witness what they believe to be a Klingon cruiser explosion. The cruiser IKS Dravana is damaged, but initially declines assistance. But with some work, they agree to be towed to Deep Space Nine for medical help. And Odo tells Worf that Kurn was injured in an incident. Kurn found some contraband and basically allowed himself to be shot by the Bosley captain. Obviously, Kurn would have been able to disarm this dude, but just let him get hurt. And Odo worries that Kurn has a death wish, and that makes him a liability. So he gets fired. And in the infirmary, Worf tries to confront Kurn, who insists he will respect Worf's wishes, but does not like all the talking. Bashir tells staff that the injuries of those aboard the Dravona don't quite match those from a starship explosion. They suggest that the ship was hit by a photon or something. Jadzia notes a torpedo would leave an ion trail, but none were found, however. So Kira adds that the Dravona was cloaked, which makes it even less likely that Klingon vessels would have targeted it. And they realize, oh, they had a cloaked mine. There are mines. And they're very worried that there could just be all these undetectable mines in the Bajoran system. Mines are not cool. Bashir comments that this is an act of war, and the flummoxed Klingons would take such a risk. They're confused. And Ben says that they can't yet prove the mines exist, but if there is a war, the mines could cut off Deep Space Nine and Bajor from the Alpha Quadrant. So Kira suggests that the Dravona's computer might have the mine coordinates, and Worf has an idea. Worf tries to convince Kurn to help, that arguing the Klingon Empire is acting dishonorably by mining space, and opposing mines is honorable, as AF. So Kurn, who opposed the decision to withdraw from the Katoma Accords, which were the peace treaties between the United Federation and planets of the Klingon Empire, he agrees that Gowron underestimates the Federation, and Worf just begs his bro to help prevent the Empire from starting a war they can't win, stating that the sons of Mogh could save their people and be glorious again. In the infirmary, Worf and Kurn undergo surgical alterations so they look like the Dravona 12. They beam onto the Dravona, and using their understanding of High Council, Kurn retrieves the mine coordinates, though a Klingon dude enters and questions their presence. And while Worf tries to pretend that he's a commander, the lieutenant isn't quite convinced, but as he tries to leave, Kurn shoots him, kills him, and also reveals that the lieutenant was actually going to attack Worf with a knife. Worf and Kurn retrieve the mine detonation codes, and Kira and O'Brien leave to destroy the mines. And that's when, afterwards, Worf is telling Jadzia that he's really very disturbed. He's lost a lot of his identity. He's really changed from living with humans and does worry about Kurn's future. And Worf is worried that he's lost his killer instinct, and the line of being between two worlds of the Federation and the Klingons is no longer realistic. So while Worf wishes so bad to be part of the Klingon society again, and is sad that Kurn doesn't even have an inkling of what Worf has, and that Kurn just is never going to have the Klingon world that he needs while existing as the Kurn that he is. That's when Jadzia suggests an alternative to the Mach Tovor ritual. Kira and Miles detonate all the mines and flush out some Klingon birds of prey. Worf finds Kurn drunk and is, content warning, suicidal. In the Klingon afterlife, it is not honorable to opt out. But Kurn points out that if he were to do that, he won't be alone, because there are others like him who will be there, who have opted out in the past. And Kurn laments not growing up with Worf, and that the sons of Mogh could have been bigger and should never have been separated, and feels like a burden, and starts to note that Worf indeed has honor. Worf promises Kurn will regain his honor, but not as his brother. This is where something funky happens. Bashir erases Kurn's memory, changes his face, gives him a new identity as Rodek, son of Nagra, a friend of Worf's family, who agreed to this terrible idea to just reinvent this guy, even though they believe it's the only way. And Kurn/Rodek wakes up, doesn't remember anything. He asks Worf if he's his family. Worf tells them he has no family, It's really sad. And he goes on to live a life of honor, not knowing who he was. And Worf wonders of his own Klingon identity and tries to realize what he still has or may have.
First off, Scott, this chemistry between Jadzia and Worf, is this just a one-off, or does this matter?
No comment.
Okay. And also, Tony Todd is back. So how often does this happen? A guest star returning to Trek, but as a different character?
Oh, it happens all the time. There are Trek actors who play 2 or 3 people, 3 or 4 people. It's not uncommon for someone to play multiple characters throughout the Trek canon, especially if there's makeup involved.
If you love the Southpaw Project, become one of our financial supporters. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. We can't exist without your contributions. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at southpawpod.com. That seems like the beauty of Aliens of the Week shows. You can bring back actors you like without making them a recurring character, which makes it so much easier.
Yeah.
Now let's get to the meat of this episode. There's a lot of socio-political meat to this.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, Sisko talking about Klingon rituals within Starfleet and the limits of cultural diversity seems pertinent.
Mm-hmm.
Except it's being criticized by a character fans probably wished was arguing for cultural diversity. But when we think of the future and a space outpost, cultural diversity probably matters even more than it does here on Earth. And the problems with cultural hegemony are probably even more oppressive because it's all the more expansive. No one really thinks about the intergalactic cultural hegemony of Starfleet, but it is kind of the future successor of the British imperial culture. I don't think the creators thought about that or how oppressive it is to other cultures, let alone other human cultures. Has anyone talked about the standpoint of putting British colonial quote unquote explorers, which are just colonizers, in space? Because I think early on we talked about how Star Trek is about a naval fleet in space, and it still harkens back to that often, but there's a lot of influence of the British Navy.
Absolutely.
Do you know if this is a topic that other Trek podcasts or books have covered?
The Trek podcasts, I really only listen to 2 other Trek podcasts. If we're being, that's not true. I listen to like 2.5. I listen to Soy Trek, which doesn't follow a particular guideline. They just sort of cover whatever they want, but they're awesome and I love them. And I do sometimes listen to Mission Log, which is the other Star Trek episode by episode guide. And they don't totally go deeply into like that sort of thing.
They don't go where no one has gone before?
That's funny. I mean, they try to. They just. I have no issue with Mission Log. I really enjoy them. In fact, if I'm doing a rewatch of a show and I just want to miss an episode, I might just listen to an episode of Mission Log. They just don't go deep politically into it. It's very surface level. It's very like you could win a trivia contest listening to these episodes. And my friend Alana Levin does on their podcast channel Deep Space Dive, which goes into concepts from Deep Space Nine. And I was on an episode talking about Miles and Keiko's relationship. But yeah, no, they're not going into it the way that we're going into it. And that's not saying anything bad about it. It's just answering your question.
So for us to dive into this, what I'm talking about is not just how the characters dress, carry themselves, or speak, or the spirit of Starfleet, but also from how the acting is influenced by the Royal Academy and Dieta. It's too much to talk about in one episode, but someone could write a whole book about how Starfleet is the successor of Western hegemony and British naval culture, replicating itself in space. But going back to this episode, questions arise. Other meaty, heavy questions arise about national identity and nationalism. Should your identity mean supporting the actions of the worst actors in your community? Does it mean blindly supporting a nation state? Is loyalty to what you perceive as your people more important than doing what's right? This is always pertinent for Americans, but right now, this has become a heated argument amongst Jewish people across the world. Worf kind of acts like a removed proxy for a lot of very human situations. I know you've always found Klingons interesting, Scott. What did you think about some of these themes?
So I think the trope of a character feeling distance from their culture and people is one, a very profound trope in sci-fi, but also a profound trope in writing. So the and this trope also happens a lot in Deep Space Nine. We have Worf, who is the Klingon, who is also the Federation guy. We have, Garrick, who is the Cardassian without a home. We have Odo, who's also didn't even realize that he was part of a culture that he didn't even know. Even to some extent, you have Kira, who's without many of her Bajoran people. And obviously, we have Ben, who is without part of his family. So people being disconnected from where they come from is a very potent and powerful part of Deep Space Nine. And Worf just creates a very important and familiar feeling of that in the show because, one, Deep Space Nine gets considerably better when he shows up, and people that love Worf from Star Trek come here and they already know this person and the crux of his pain. Because his pain is he human or is he Klingon? And to him, he's both. Even though phenotypically he's unquestionably Klingon. But he's not from a monoculture, and he's existing that way. Now, talking about how that imparts my own experience, I don't think I'm really prepared to go into this evening, but I definitely relate to Worf in some ways.
In seeing Worf in the series, to your point, he is more human like. He seems to accept that. Klingon actions sometimes repulse him. And from a socio-political perspective, you could think of it as Worf having a human gaze, returning to cultural hegemony.
Mm-hmm.
In our world, examples of gazes are the white gaze, the Western gaze, or the male gaze. The problem with this in Star Trek is using the human gaze to judge non-humans, similar to using the white gaze to judge non-white people, male gaze to judge non-men.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, I've pointed out that Dax doesn't understand consent. Just off the top of my head, and I'm sure there's examples I'm missing here, but like when she coerced Quark to give up his body to be one of her personalities, or her response to Kira being assaulted on the holosuite, or even recently her prank where she moves all of Odo's stuff, which seems like an obnoxious joke, but as part of a greater pattern, it reads different. And here we go again with Dax. This time she suggests wiping Kurn's brain without his consent, but also altering his body. And they do that. From an ethical perspective, medical ethical perspective, that's wrong. And going back to Bashir's Hippocratic Oath, which there was a whole episode about that, it's even worse that Bashir went along with it. So, what's the moral lesson here? What's the Starfleet lesson here? Death with dignity with the person's consent is wrong under Starfleet and Western culture, but the death of your personhood without consent and denying your bodily autonomy is okay, which, yeah, that's what happened to indigenous and enslaved people by Western hegemony. So I guess that's a blind spot that writers carry into a show about space, cultures, and British doctors. Thinking about it from that perspective, Worf denying his brother didn't make me feel bad for him. However, this episode dealt with some heavy, pertinent themes, and everyone did their jobs well, whether I agree with them or not. And I feel like these episodes really age well just because so many of these themes are becoming pertinent now. Scott, from mythology to quality, how did you rate this episode?
So the thing is, again, this season is just getting better and better. So this is like a solid 3.5 stars. There's a lot of mythology that is teensy tiny important to the story. And I'm not going to go too deeply into it. It's almost a 4, but I can't just give everything a 4.
No, yeah.
I'm giving it a 3.5. It's a great episode. The morals of Kurn and what they did to Kurn definitely doesn't feel good.
I think you called it a long time ago, right? That DS9 would just get more gray and gray.
Yes.
Can you tell us about the next episode?
The boss needs you. You don't need them.
Until then,